Hi, at the end of all these videos, I always make an appeal for people to send in their questions or their topics they'd like me to discuss, and I've really only gotten a handful of them over the months. Well, I recently got a request to make a video about the book of Revelation. I must admit that for me, along with many other church leaders over history, the book of Revelation is a little bit daunting. Not only is it a bit overwhelming with all the symbolism in the text, but there's also the fair fact that the greatest minds in the church have often not had a whole lot that they can say about it. So all that is to say that if you came to this video hoping to have kind of a comprehensive unpacking of all the meaning of the book of Revelation, I'm afraid it's going to disappoint you. However, I do have one or two things to say that I think might be helpful to at least some people. Now, the first thing you need to know is that the book of Revelation is a great example of what we call apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature is the kind of literature that only arises in the midst of a community that is being heavily persecuted by the larger community. That is to say, you don't tend to get genuine apocalyptic literature when you live in a place that has protected freedom of speech, or when people seem to think that everything's going really well. You only tend to get it when you have a group of people who feel they cannot speak openly about the things that concern them. The book of Revelation is the product of a group of people who are both deeply oppressed and incredibly overwhelmed. And so what that means is that a lot of the book is written in a kind of code. Now, I'm not trying to be overly romantic here, as if somehow the people were speaking only of the secret mysteries of God for the future, and if we simply crack the code, we'll be able to get down and find out exactly what's going to happen down the road. What I'm saying is, there's a lot of things they want to be able to say that they simply cannot say in plain language, or else they'll be tracked down and captured and maybe even killed. This means that when we study the book of Revelation, we may not find quite so much about details of the far-flung future as we may want. But what we may find is a lot of words of encouragement to a group of people who are not free to criticize and speak openly of their leaders. One example of the kind of code I'm talking about is with the number 666 that we read about in the book of Revelation. I've read a couple different accounts that suggest that this number was actually meant to refer to a particularly oppressive leader, either at that time or in the recent past. Now, the things that I've read haven't been able to totally agree on which ruler they're talking about, but that kind of illustrates the point. That is, if it needs to be the kind of thing where you can communicate with your intended audience so they will understand immediately what it is, but if you're part of an audience outside of that, like we are today, it isn't obvious, and it couldn't be obvious, because if it was obvious, it would no longer be useful as a code. Another more modern example of a kind of coding system to use so you're not overheard by those people you don't want to hear you is Cockney rhyming slang. Now, the idea of that, and you can look this up, is this idea of taking rhyming words and using them to substitute into what you're saying words or phrases that are either meaningless or harmless, instead of the ones that you don't want to be overheard. Here's a good thing to remember. People did not write apocalyptic literature and distribute it with the hope that they'll be confusing or the hope that they'll be misunderstood. They wanted to be understood. And so it seems reasonable to assume that even if things are complicated for us, and even if we don't know for sure what was being intended, the original audience would have understood exactly what was being meant at the time. If we have a hard time understanding apocalyptic literature, it could mean many things. It could mean that we just live in too far away of a place and too distant of a time to understand it. It could be that we're living lives that are far too comfortable to really understand the plight of those who are terribly oppressed and overwhelmed like that. What it doesn't mean is that they were either confused or necessarily telling tales about the far-off future. Now, there is some discussion in the book of Revelation about where history is going in the end, but that only seems to be the main concern in the last couple of chapters of the book. The other thing I want to point out is that there seem to be moments in the book of Revelation where it seems as though it's actually very clear what they're talking about, although it's being done in perhaps a strange way. One great example, and one that is pretty easy for any Christian to figure out, is the lamb that was slain that's talked about in Revelation chapter 5. It's pretty clear that it's talking about Jesus. But if you're not a Jewish person, you're not a Christian person, it might be very difficult for you to figure out what they're talking about. Another example, and one that's a little bit weirder, is in Revelation chapter 12, where we read the story about Christmas, but we don't read about it with Mary and Joseph running away from Herod and all the rest. What we have is a woman with a crown and tiara of 12 stars running away from a red dragon who wants to swallow her child. One symbolism that's gotten a lot of attention over the years is in chapter 17, where we read about a woman who's described as the whore of Babylon. Now, it's pretty clear that they're not talking about Babylon, which would make sense because the Babylonian Empire died out centuries before. The clue that there's something going on here is in verse 9 of the passage, where it's describing the 7 heads of the beast that the whore of Babylon is riding on. It says, the 7 heads are the 7 hills on which the woman sits. Now, the most famous example of a city that's been built on 7 hills is Rome, and for a long time, Protestants have had a great deal of desire to make that Whore of Babylon be a symbol of the Pope. But especially if we consider the time in which this was written, when there was not yet no Pope, but there was, however, a brutal Roman government who had turned on the Christians, it's possible that it might be referring to that instead. Incidentally, there are actually a lot of cities that have been built, or at least are said to be built, on 7 hills. Rome is just the more famous. In fact, if you wanted to, you could probably make this passage talk about almost anybody that someone didn't like, because some of the examples of cities that are built on 7 hills are Rome, but also Jerusalem, or Mecca, or Istanbul, or Edinburgh, even, or Tehran, or Moscow, or even in America, San Francisco, California, or Lynchburg, Virginia. For my money, this is what I get out of the book of Revelation. God is in control. Even when evil sets up a stronghold in your area and causes persecution and pain and destruction, God is still in control. Redemption is already worked out, although it is not yet manifest. God's work of creation will not finally pass away, but it will be resurrected in glory with the new heaven and the new earth. I know there's lots of folks who say they've gotten a lot of information out of the book of Revelation, and I apologize that I can't unpack more of it for you. But my experience has shown me that this has been quite enough for me to try to get my head wrapped around and try to integrate into my life. If I understand that basic message of Revelation correctly, it gives you a lot of hope and a lot of reminder that God is in control. Well, that's all for this week. If you have any questions or any topics you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevic@gmail.com. If you found these videos to be helpful or interesting or engaging, please consider liking and sharing them on the various social media platforms. And if you want, you can watch these videos on the YouTube channel that I post them on, which is /tstevic1. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you next time.